Welcome back to the deep dive. So you gave us this incredible stack of sources, articles, a few research papers, some notes, and they all seem to circle around this one really powerful question.
A very uncomfortable one, too.
Right. If everybody's failing by the same standard, then what on earth does that standard actually mean? So today, our mission is to unpack that, the psychological weight, the systemic reasons for conformity, and really the cost of mistaking consensus for truth.
Yeah.
I want to start with a number that just felt, deeply familiar. 90%. Just think about that. 90% of people are all doing something the same way, taking the same test, chasing the same metric, getting rejected for not meeting the same standard.
And it's not because they all believe in it?
No, it's because they're terrified of being in that last 10%. They're afraid of the exclusion, the judgment, being the one who sticks out.
And that fear, it drives this silent shift in our thinking. It's what sources are calling the great modern confusion of consensus with truth.
Explain that a little.
Well, if a process or a metric is just repeated long enough and, enough important people adopt it, it sort of stops feeling like a theory.
It just becomes right.
It becomes the way things are done. Exactly.
And the sources are so clear on this. History is just full of examples where the majority believing something didn't make it true. It just made it way harder to question.
That's the conflict right there.
It is. It reminds me of the existentialist thinkers like Camus. He wouldn't ask if a standard is, reasonable. He would ask something much, much harder.
Something that gets to the root of it.
Yeah. He'd ask, if everyone is wrong in the same way, where does the rightness lie?
Wow. And that just forces you out of that simple binary of, pass or fail.
It does. It pushes you into the realm of meaning. When you see that much identical failure, you have to start thinking maybe the system itself is, detached from reality.
Okay, let's unpack this then.
Yeah.
We're moving from a simple question of, am I achieving enough, to something much deeper.
To, is what I'm achieving even meaningful?
Right. And to get there, to understand why we cling to these standards, even when they're failing, we have to look at the psychological roots. You pointed out those little phrases we all use.
Oh yeah, laws are laws, or the standard has been set.
Everyone does it this way.
Exactly. They sound so harmless, like just common sense, but they trigger a huge internal shift.
How so?
Well, you start asking the important question about meaning, like, is this valuable? Does this actually help? And you start asking about your position.
Just, do I meet the standard? Am I safe?
Am I safe? That's everything. It reminds me of what Sartre said, about humans being so willing to give up real freedom for just a feeling of security.
And a standard gives you exactly that. It's a relief. It tells you where you stand, what to do next, and maybe most importantly, it kind of absolves you of the responsibility of choosing.
You don't have to wonder if you're on the right road. You're glad there's a road at all.
And this craving for a clear road, it's deep. It goes back to our survival instincts. The brain doesn't see standards as moral concepts at first.
It sees them as survival fences.
That's a perfect way to put it. That 7-second rule. The brain takes about 7 seconds when you walk into a room of strangers to figure out if you're okay, if you belong.
So you learn to signal compliance really fast.
You have to. Deviating gets you seen, judged, and maybe pushed out of the group. So we need the standard initially, not for growth, but just for belonging.
Which is what makes the whole Kafkaesque trap so terrifying. What happens when the rules you're trying to follow for survival you can't even see them clearly.
Right. You find yourself being judged by rules that are never actually explained to you.
And Kafka's genius was realizing the scary part isn't just a harsh system.
No, it's the collective effort. The shared willingness to follow the rules without even knowing why. The daily exhaustion of complying with a process when you have no idea what the ultimate goal is.
But hold on, if the rule is hidden, how can anyone even agree to follow it? Isn't that just mass self-deception?
It is. But the standard, even a hidden one, provides the feeling of a structure. And as long as I feel like I'm complying, I feel like I've done my part.
And you've avoided being kicked out of the group.
Exactly. The compliance itself becomes the goal. It completely replaces whatever the original useful purpose of that standard was.
Okay, so the standard gives us this feeling of safety. But what happens when it breaks? When the metrics don't produce results, or following the path just leads to total burnout.
Well, that's the paradox, isn't it? When lots of people fail, our first instinct is never, maybe the standard is broken.
Never. It's always people are weaker now.
They just don't have the discipline. But the material we looked at suggests this really difficult alternative.
Which is that maybe the standard just isn't relevant to real human life anymore. and we're all just afraid to admit it.
This is straight out of Nietzsche. He warned about values that weren't created to serve life, to help us flourish, but were created just to control it.
And how are those values protected? Not by logic or reason.
By repetition. Just sheer repetition. Everyone does it, so it must be right. And suddenly, not conforming isn't just a different choice.
It's a moral failure, a character flaw.
And that's the trick. That's how accountability gets shifted completely onto the individual. When someone fails, we never ask the system, hey, is this standard even reasonable for this person's life right now?
No, we skip right to where did they slack off? Where did they fail to try hard enough?
And this whole phenomenon where standard keeps its power even after it loses its purpose is what Camus called, well, he called it legalized absurdity.
Which doesn't mean it's totally meaningless.
No, not at all. It just means its meaning is no longer up for debate. It becomes right simply because it exists, not because it exists for a good reason.
We see that everywhere. I mean, think about the example of the student choosing a major.
Oh, that was a great one. They're not choosing out of curiosity.
Not at all. They're choosing based on an external metric, like last year's passing scores, to get into what they think is a high-status career.
And then, years later, when that career feels totally empty, what do they blame?
Never the standard. They blame themselves. I didn't try hard enough, or I just couldn't push through. The standard gets a free pass.
That's the real tragedy. You internalize this feeling of being wrong even when you did everything the system asked of you.
So that gets us to the inertia. Why are these things so hard to get rid of, even when we all kind of know they're not working?
It's powerful. One of our sources had a great line about this. A standard almost never dies because it's wrong.
It only dies when keeping it becomes more expensive than changing it.
Exactly. It's about convenience. Standards weren't created to measure reality perfectly. They were created to simplify the management of people.
It's faster. You don't need nuanced person-by-person assessment.
Right. And we can break down how they survive into these three kind of invisible tiers.
Okay, let's do it. Tier 1 is the technical layer. What's that?
The technical layer is just the tool itself, the KPI, the score, the procedure on paper. It was created to solve one problem in one specific context.
But the world changes so much faster than the tools.
So much faster. Think about standardized tests designed 50 years ago for an industrial economy. The context is gone, but the test is still here. And the really Kafkaesque danger is that nobody has the official authority to say it's obsolete.
So the system just keeps stamping the form because no one wrote the manual on how to update the manual.
You got it. Which brings us to tier 2. The benefit layer.
Okay.
As soon as you have a standard, you create winners and losers. And the winners, the people who did well under the old system, have zero incentive to change it.
Of course not, because questioning the standard means questioning why they're in charge or why they have their status.
It questions the legitimacy of their own position, which, Nietzsche would say the most respected values are usually the ones that serve the people who are already at an advantage.
So standards are preserved for stability, not truth.
Spot on.
Yeah.
And that leads to the final one, tier 3. The collective psychological layer.
This is the cultural part.
Yeah. A standard that's been around long enough just gets woven into the social identity. It becomes how things are done here.
Camus called this the shift from choice to destiny, right?
Exactly. You stop choosing to follow it. You just feel like you're living inside it, like it's inevitable.
The best example of this was the unwritten rule in a workplace about long hours.
Oh, that's so real.
It is. If the culture values face time, the person who leaves at 5, even with all their work done, is seen as lazy.
They lack dedication.
And that standard is self-policing. You don't need a memo from the CEO. Your colleagues enforce it on each other.
And that's the ultimate control that Kafka saw. The system doesn't need a guard at the top when everyone is guarding everyone else.
So when we're trapped in these systems, the damage to the individual it's huge. It creates this fatigue you can't even name.
Yes. You're doing everything right by the system's rules on time, on demand, but you have this deep, nagging lack of rightness in your own life.
It's that feeling Camus talked about, being caught between two things you can't stand. Staying feels empty, but leaving is absolutely terrifying.
Because that fear of being excluded is still one of our deepest, most primal fears.
And the real danger is when those external rules start to define who you think you are.
That's the invasion. You go from this standard is a problem to maybe I'm not suitable for this.
And then to the most dangerous thought of all, I must be the problem.
It's self-punishment without any chains. You just accept the story that your failure is a personal moral one.
And this connects so directly to that idea of the postponement of life, the Trehan song. It's such a powerful concept.
It really is.
It says that when people stop believing in the standard, they don't actually leave the standard.
They leave their own lives.
Yes, they postpone their real feelings, they shut down their questions, they tell themselves, I'll live my real life later.
After the promotion, after I hit this metric, after the kids are grown.
It's what Kim has called the suicide of meaning. You're functional, you show up, but you aren't really present in your own existence.
So the question is, how do you navigate this without just being totally consumed? The sources give us some difficult, very non-heroic answers.
These aren't about starting a revolution, they're about internal survival. Let's go through them. The first is separate self-worth from measurement.
Easier said than done.
Incredibly. It means you have to refuse to let that external number, your review score, your kid's college acceptance, answer that deep internal question of, am I worthy?
So you still participate, you still file the report, but internally, you don't let that metric define you. It's a constant act of maintaining a boundary.
Okay, strategy 2, create unjudged spaces.
I love this one. It's about having a small corner of your life where standards just have no power.
Like a hobby you refuse to monetize or optimize.
Or a friendship that's just about connection, not about proving anything. It has to be a place, as Kafka's characters search for, not subject to judgment, a place to just be.
Strategy 3, question. Quietly. This isn't about some big public fight.
No, it's about breaking the automation inside your own head. Just asking yourself, what was this standard for? Does it actually serve life now?
Just asking the question stops that silent, unconscious acceptance.
And the last one is maybe the hardest. Strategy 4, accept small losses.
What does that mean?
It means that sometimes to hold a boundary, you're going to be a little slower on the career path. You might be less recognized. Someone might call you less aggressive.
And you have to be okay with that.
You accept that small, manageable loss to avoid the huge, soul-crushing loss of self that comes from years of silent compliance.
So when you put this all together, what's the takeaway? The goal isn't chaos, right? Not a world with zero standards.
No, absolutely not. The true promised land, as one source called it, is just a place where the standard stops impersonating truth.
Where you can finally see it for what it is.
A tool. A necessary, maybe, but flawed tool for managing things. It is not a definition of right and wrong, and it is definitely not a measure of your worth as a human being.
And that shift in language is everything. You stop being so angry at the standard. You stop letting it define you. You stop saying, I am this standard.
And you start saying, I am using this standard for a specific, temporary purpose.
Camus reminds us the real tragedy isn't always active oppression. Sometimes it's just getting so used to the standards that we forget we even have a choice.
He said that just refusing to lie to yourself in a world built on these enforced standards is an act that is powerful enough to maintain your own existence.
And that's the real thought to leave you with. If a standard is causing the majority of people to live with this constant nagging feeling that they're fundamentally wrong, and you've seen that truth is continuing to comply without ever questioning its meaning, is that still an innocent choice? Something for you to mull over as you navigate the structures in your own life?